The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. And as prior, we hear that this is your first congressional testimony, so we'll ask you the really tough questions. Kidding. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Since our subcommittee's last hearing on Lebanon, much has changed in our bilateral relationship. Both Lebanon and the United States have new presidents. The picture in neighboring Syria continues to look dire. ISIS appears to be on its last legs yet again. But despite these changes, and in some cases because of them, many of the same challenges and concerns about Lebanon and U.S. policy remain. As one of my Israeli friends put it, Lebanon is essentially a constitution without a state. Weak political institutions, combined with the influx of refugees from Syria, have strained the Lebanese government to the point where it struggles to provide even the most basic of services. Most Syrian refugees, numbering well over 1.5 million now, are living in substandard shelters or apartments, struggling to find work, facing increasing hostility from native Lebanese. Refugees now make up about 1/3 of the country's population. Wow. Economic challenges, including the Syrian war's damage to Lebanon's tourism, real estate, and construction industries, means that Lebanon's unemployment issues are set to continue and get even worse in the future. Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terror group that controls many aspects of the Lebanese government and society, is only getting stronger as its fighters come back from Syria armed with new skills, with new weapons, and with its ally Assad sadly still in power. This is not only a threat to the future and stability of Lebanon, but it presents one of the greatest threats to our ally, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, and to our own national security interests as well, especially when you consider that Lebanon's new president, Michel Aoun, is a longtime ally of Hezbollah, at one point stating Hezbollah is necessary so that it can battle Israel. Now, I am aware that there are those who argue that supporting the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, is essential to developing strong security institutions that could serve as a counterweight to Hezbollah. While I understand the need for an LAF that can protect Lebanon's borders, its territorial integrity, and at least in theory, mitigate Hezbollah's influence, reports of LAF and Hezbollah coordination and LAF-Hezbollah cooperation have long given me concern over the U.S. commitment to supporting the LAF. In fact, just this past August, Hezbollah and the Lebanese armed forces launched simultaneous operations against ISIS along the Lebanese-Syrian border, with numerous reports of coordination between the two groups. The message that we should be delivering to Lebanon is, if they want U.S. military assistance, the LAF can either cut off ties with Hezbollah completely and unequivocally, or they have to go at it alone. We must not allow any U.S. equipment to fall into the hands of Hezbollah or any other terrorist organization. But we provide more than just military assistance, and U.S. aid has its work cut out for itself as it works to respond to Lebanon's need for essentials like clean water, food, economic opportunities, especially when considering the influx of refugees. I'm interested in hearing what kind of work state and U.S. aid are doing to prepare for Lebanon's legislative elections next year, with the stakes higher than ever as Hezbollah and Iran try to cement their control. I'm also interested in hearing any updates on the current status of United States permanent resident and Lebanese citizen Nizar Zakaf. By now, we should all be familiar with Nizar's story. Invited by the Iranians to participate in a conference, then detained, then arrested, and tried and convicted of trumped-up espionage charges, all in an effort by Tehran to exact political and financial concessions. We heard from his youngest son, Omar, just a few months ago. He sat right here in this room in front of us, and he described what he and his family have gone through with the uncertainty of his father's future and, more importantly, his father's health, which is failing. So I hope to hear some positive updates on what state is doing and what Lebanon is doing to bring Nizar home. As we talk about the best way to confront Lebanon's numerous challenges, be they political, economic, security, or humanitarian, I worry that our short-term objectives in Lebanon are getting lost in what needs to be a broader strategy in the Middle East. With Assad consolidating power in Damascus, Tehran continuing to reap the benefits of the JCPOA, and Hezbollah gaining even more power in Beirut, Iran's infamous land bridge to Lebanon appears all but complete. Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel have a great bill, the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Amendments Act, which would up the sanctions pressure on the terrorist group, and I'm hopeful that it gets signed into law soon. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses on exactly how U.S. policy has changed over the past year, how the administration's budget request for Lebanon corresponds to our U.S. national security interests, and how it all fits into our strategy for the region as a whole. U.S. policy in Lebanon must be calibrated to scale back Hezbollah and Iran's influence while spurring much-needed security, stability, and prosperity for the country. But I have serious concerns about whether we're having the impact that we all desire. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to my ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for convening today's hearings. Thanks to our witnesses for joining us. Lebanon is a nation long defined by the role of outside forces and internal struggle. The borders of Lebanon as a sovereign state were drawn by France after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I to include three main sectarian identities that have continued to play a defining role today: Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and Maronite Christians, who disagreed on the direction of the country, spent 15 years in civil war, and continued sectarian strife since that war ended in 1990. Today, it's the civil war in neighboring Syria that has opened its arms to help its suffering neighbors, that's really altered the reality in Lebanon, because Lebanon has opened its arms to help its suffering neighbors, but has struggled to keep up with the sheer scale of the influx. Lebanon has absorbed over 1 million Syrian refugees in a nation of just 4 million people. Think about that. More than 25% of the entire country's population would be proportionally equivalent to the United States taking in over 80 million refugees in just a few years. The United States has stepped up with increased assistance, offering hundreds of millions of dollars in aid for better access to education, improved water and infrastructure services, and to help ensure good governance. And at a time when Syrians now represent about 40% of Lebanon's public school students, 40% of the public school students, we have built new schools and trained teachers to care for the flow of traumatized students. But while we look and see the chaos, Hezbollah has looked on and has seen opportunity. Over the past several years, Hezbollah, rather than adhering to UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which calls for the disarmament of all armed groups in Lebanon, has done exactly the opposite. With the support of Iran, Hezbollah has built up its military capacity, intervened in Syria to prop up the Assad regime, and firmly entrenched itself in the Lebanese government. Earlier this year, the new Lebanese President Michel Aoun called Hezbollah a resistance army and an essential part of Lebanon's defense. Meanwhile, Hezbollah now holds roughly 10% of the seats in parliament. Hezbollah is now so deeply ingrained into Lebanon's architecture that some Shiite populations have no choice but to rely on it not just for security, but for social services, school, and health care. And I think it's worth repeating the obvious here. A legitimate Lebanese government can't function effectively when it is in constant power struggle to govern with a non-state actor. Calling themselves a resistance movement or a political party does not diminish from what Hezbollah truly is, an Iranian-backed terror organization. Hezbollah's activities have destabilized the entire region, from its thousands of fighters in Syria to its attacks around the globe that have killed Americans, Europeans, Israelis, and Arabs. When we held a hearing on Lebanon in this room just 3 years back, I noted that Hezbollah dangerously had more than 75,000 rockets aimed at Israel. Today, as a result of direct support from Iran, Hezbollah has over 150,000 missiles and rockets now capable of reaching every corner of Israeli territory. In that same hearing, just before Lebanon's elections, I expressed my concern that the selection of a new president who is beholden to Hezbollah would greatly diminish efforts to ensure the Lebanon armed forces have sole responsibility for the country's security. Sadly, I think my concerns have proven to be well-founded. We are now seeing the Lebanese armed forces, who should have a monopoly over security in the country, coordinate with Hezbollah to fight ISIS in the border region with Syria. So I hope our witnesses today can help us unpack this dangerous trend, help us understand the administration's strategy for working with our international partners to help Lebanese society overcome the influence and penetration of Hezbollah. And finally, Mr. Ratney, I hope we can take this opportunity to discuss an issue that's not only pertinent to U.S. policy in Lebanon, but also U.S. policy more broadly in the region. Former National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, Jake Sullivan, testified earlier today in our full committee that this administration's strategy in Syria, as he put it, has created open running room for Iran, its client Assad, and its proxy Hezbollah to assert greater control over Syria, including areas adjacent to the border with Israel. Current policy has been casual about allowing Iran and Hezbollah to exploit de-escalation zones to their advantage, creating the very real risk that Iran and its proxies set up a permanent presence on Israel's border with Syria. Now, moreover, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has indicated that Russia and Syria have taken advantage of the de-escalation zones to change the balance of power on the ground and to retake the territory that they previously controlled before May. You helped to negotiate these de-escalation zones, so I hope you can provide us with some insight into the decision-making process, how it fits into the overall strategy to push back against Iran and to help end the bloodshed in Syria. Madam Chair, I appreciate it, and thanks so much to our witnesses again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. And now I'm pleased to recognize members who, if they could make an opening statement. I first turn to Mr. Issa, who is a renowned expert on Lebanon and has more than a familiar interest in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The late Henry Hyde once accused me of having an apartment in Lebanon. I was there so often, although it's been Egypt more lately. Madam Chair, you said something that I wanted to set the record straight on. A reference toward, if you will, intolerance or anger toward the refugees, although it could exist, pales in comparison to what we would have in the United States if we had over 100 million refugees suddenly here. The Lebanese have been incredibly tolerant and helpful, putting basically double shifts on all their schools, even though they can't afford it, in order to try to educate and maintain these people. I visited Lebanon and saw what is essentially pieces of wood, cardboard, and a piece of plastic along the edge of a road, but it's still the best that could be done with the funds available. The one point that I think I would take personal privilege with is there are three parties. Yes, one of them is Christian, but the mosaic of Lebanon includes Orthodox and plenty of other religions that have historically been both together and at odds. In fact, to paraphrase Winston Churchill in 1907, the worst form of government there is democracy, except for all the others. The reality is Lebanon is a dysfunctional democracy because it is a captured state. They do the best they can. It is not good enough. But I would say here today that if we disengage from Lebanon, inevitably we give that country to those who have taken it hostage, to Iran, to Hezbollah, and only through active engagement toward backing the moderate forces that predominantly are, in fact, in control of Lebanon, do we have an opportunity to guarantee that they will not have that land bridge all the way to the edge of Israel and to the Mediterranean. So, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to both of our witnesses.
And I thank you, Mr. Issa, for setting the record straight. You're quite right in making that comparison.
You know, as a Lebanese American of Orthodox faith, I just had to go one past that Maronite dominance that was assumed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Issa, as always. And now, pleased to yield to Mr. Boyle.
Well, thank you, and I applaud the subcommittee chair and ranking member for holding this hearing, I believe that a country we pay too little attention to in a very busy and active Middle East is Lebanon, especially for its ability and potential to further destabilize the region. I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony today, and when I ask my questions, I'll really be focusing on those 150,000 rockets that Ranking Member Deutsch spoke about, and some comments that I was given from a couple of Israeli generals the last time I was there about the prospects for a third Israeli-Lebanon war. But anyway, I'll reserve that until it's time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And seeing no further requests for time, I will introduce our witnesses, but I want to point out that I'm so very pleased that President Trump and Secretary Tillerson have nominated Dr. Ileana Poblet for the position of Assistant Secretary of State Verification and Compliance. Happened just today, and for nearly 20 years, Dr. Poblet was my senior advisor on foreign affairs matters and served as the Chief of Staff and Staff Director for our full committee. So we wish her much success, and I hope that the Senate approves her nomination quickly. And now I'm pleased to welcome our witnesses. First, Michael Ratney, who serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs for the State Department. Prior to Michael's appointment, he served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria and as the U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem. Since joining the Foreign Service, Mr. Ratney has done multiple tours in the Middle East, North Africa region, and beyond. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and I'm sorry that we missed you the last time that we were traveling through Israel a few months ago, and we look forward to your testimony, Mr. Ratney. And next, we welcome Jean Pryor. She's the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Middle East Bureau of U.S. Aid, with a focus on Lebanon, Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. Prior to this position, Ms. Pryor served as the Director of the Office of Middle East Affairs. Ms. Pryor has also held various positions for U.S. aid in Afghanistan and other countries in the region. Thank you so much, Jean, for being with us, and we look forward to your testimony. And I want the members to know that we had invited the Department of Defense to come and offer a witness for this hearing, but unfortunately repeated attempts to confirm a witness went unanswered. So we thank you for coming. Mr. Ratney, we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me here today to discuss our bilateral relationship with Lebanon. I'd like to request that my full opening statement be submitted for the record. Lebanon has a critical role to play in facing our foremost national security challenges in the Middle East, from the campaign to defeat ISIS to our efforts to push back against Iran's malign influence. A safe, stable, and prosperous Lebanon is key to advancing a range of U.S. interests. In July, President Trump welcomed Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri to Washington and reaffirmed our continued support for Lebanon. Both leaders discussed the challenges facing Lebanon, including Hezbollah's destabilizing influence, the threat of ISIS and other violent extremist groups, as well as the refugee situation. President Trump expressed our government's deep concerns regarding Hezbollah's activities, particularly those in Syria. He pledged the U.S. government's continuing assistance in strengthening Lebanon's institutions, especially the Lebanese armed forces, as a bulwark against extremism and instability. To that end, the United States is and will remain Lebanon's top security assistance partner. Since 2006, the United States has provided more than $1.5 billion in security assistance, including the provision of training and military equipment. There's no better evidence of the impact of this support than the Lebanese Army's successes against ISIS. The Lebanese Armed Forces, or the LAF as it's known, has been defending Lebanon's borders and fighting ISIS since ISIS first invaded Lebanon in 2014. And what they've accomplished in such a short time and under very difficult circumstances has been extremely impressive. However, Lebanon faces many challenges. Few countries have suffered as much from the spillover of the crisis in Syria. Today, 1 out of 5 people in Lebanon is a refugee, more per capita than any other country, including more than 1 million Syrians. This is, as you've noted, an incredible number for a country smaller than the state of Connecticut. The United States stands ready to help. Since the start of the crisis, the United States provided nearly $1.6 billion in humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees and to the communities that host them in Lebanon. We've also provided $1.2 billion in economic and development assistance since 2006 to the Lebanese people, strengthening the Lebanese government's ability to provide basic services for its people. I know my colleague from USAID will further address our efforts on that front. Lebanon faces another equally vexing challenge from the terrorist group Hezbollah. Hezbollah has long been a menace to the Lebanese state and to the region. With Iranian support, it continues to grow its military arsenal and threaten regional stability. And of course, Hezbollah exists to threaten Israel, whose citizens face the horrible reality of tens of thousands of Hezbollah rockets pointed southward. I don't need to tell you how profoundly dangerous a war between Israel and Hezbollah would be. Hezbollah continuously attempts to undermine the LAF as the sole legitimate defender of Lebanon. It also works to undermine the Lebanese government's authority, and through its actions in Syria, it further destabilizes an already fragile region. One recent step we've taken to push back against Hezbollah is to work with the UN Security Council to strengthen UNIFIL's mandate. The new strengthened resolution passed on August 30th demands that UNIFIL enhance its patrols and inspections in southern Lebanon, something we think is necessary to ensure Hezbollah cannot continue to build up its military arsenal so close to our ally, Israel. The new resolution also calls for timelines and benchmarks for UNIFIL to help build up the LAF's capacity. We're also implementing sanctions authorities that Congress has provided in order to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities and dismantle its finances. We continue to coordinate with our colleagues at Treasury and in the intelligence community in this effort. And just yesterday, the State Department announced rewards for justice offers for 2 senior Hezbollah operatives. In these and many other ways, we're working to promote a safe, independent, and stable Lebanon, which is in the interest of the American people as much as it is in the interest of the Lebanese. So thank you for the invitation to testify before the subcommittee, and I welcome the opportunity to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. Ms. Pryor.
Thank you. Thank you. Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss USAID assistance to Lebanon. Since 2006, with the support of Congress, the United States has provided approximately $1.2 billion in economic assistance to the Lebanese people. Together with USAID's technical expertise, these funds have played a critical role in promoting Lebanon's stability through programs focused on good governance, education, clean water, and social cohesion. As Deputy Assistant Secretary Ratney outlined, Lebanon is facing many challenges. The spillover from the Syria crisis has weakened the Lebanese economy and put excessive pressure on the delivery of services. Investment and trade with neighbors has slowed, tourism is down sharply, and unemployment has nearly doubled since 2012. In the context of these challenges, I would like to talk briefly about how USAID's programming is helping local partners deliver services across Lebanon, supporting Lebanon's private sector, and enhancing inclusive economic growth. One program I would like to highlight is the Middle East North Africa Investment Initiative, which supports business startups. These are the Lebanese entrepreneurs who are pushing Lebanon forward and creating jobs. Among them is a 28-year-old woman who studied in Montreal and returned home to open a small food processing factory in northern Lebanon. She applied for investment capital and received $200,000 to expand operations and hire more people. Today, this woman owns the first wheat-free bakery in Lebanon. When I was in Beirut in September, I had the chance to visit her cafe. Her products are now available at grocery stores in Lebanon, and she is looking to expand into international markets. A separate project works with thousands of micro, small, and medium-scale producers, processors, and cooperatives in Lebanon. As part of the program, USAID has helped more than 1,500 families generate $3 million in sales through the production and marketing of honey. These businesses are great examples of the lasting impact that small USAID investments can have in Lebanon. USAID is currently working in partnership with municipalities and civil society throughout Lebanon to promote stability and counter malign influences by improving access to public services, empowering civil society to promote a culture of good citizenship, and offering opportunities to youth and other marginalized populations. USAID coordinates with the Ministry of Education and Higher Education to strengthen the quality of Lebanon's public schools by training teachers, improving reading skills, and increasing access to education for vulnerable Lebanese and Syrian refugees. Last month, I visited a public school in Mount Lebanon, where children attend in 2 shifts because of the increase in students due to the Syrian crisis. This school and 150 other schools across Lebanon benefit from our retention support program with UNICEF, which provides academic and extracurricular help to prevent Lebanese and non-Lebanese children from dropping out of school. Another aspect of our education support is the University Scholarship Program that gives financially disadvantaged youth an opportunity to study at either the American University of Beirut or the Lebanese American University. Since 2010, with the support of Congress, USAID has funded nearly 900 undergraduate scholarships, with 110 candidates expected to start in the next academic year. Last month, I spoke with 18 recipients who shared how the scholarship has affected them, their families, and communities. One student from southern Lebanon told me the support allowed her to be the first person from her village to attend university. These scholars are leaders and change makers in their communities. The scholarship program also plays an important role in promoting American educational and democratic values abroad. While in Lebanon, I also traveled to the Bekaa Valley, where we helped the regional water company with new equipment, systems, and techniques for water management and treatment. With our assistance, the Bekaa Water Establishment can sustain its own operations and has improved the supply of clean water to around 1 million residents, including Syrian refugees. USAID is also providing food assistance through the World Food Program to support Syrian refugees inside Lebanon. Approximately 670,000 Syrian refugees in Lebanon receive food aid assistance through electronic food cards that are redeemable at more than 500 shops nationwide, injecting $926 million into the Lebanese economy. We believe these programs contribute to helping to secure a more peaceful, prosperous, and stable Lebanon, and we continue to work with our Lebanese partners to further mutual interests in stability and prosperity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much. Excellent testimony. We thank you both for being here. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, I'm hopeful that State can give us all an update on U.S. permanent resident and Lebanese citizen Nizar Zaka, who is being held unjustly in Iran. Mr. Ratney, can you tell us what both State and Lebanon are doing to bring Nizar home?
So, ma'am, we're well familiar with the case, and like you, we've met with his family and we follow it. There's some privacy considerations associated with discussing the specifics of it. So for the purposes of this hearing, suffice to say that we are painfully familiar with the injustices of people trapped in the darkness of the Iranian justice system. And then what I'd like to do is go back and see if we can get you some more details in a different setting, if I can.
Thank you so much, and totally understand. And Mr. Ratney, many of us are concerned about Hezbollah's influence over the Lebanese government, especially the Lebanese Armed Forces, LAF, considering the increased Hezbollah-LAF cooperation. Can you explain how our U.S. assistance to the LAF, I know you call it LAF, but it doesn't seem right, LAF, is helping to further our goal of rolling back Iranian influence throughout the region? And do you support conditioning our aid to the LAF on the LAF cutting its ties with Hezbollah?
Thanks, ma'am. It's a very important question. Our embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, gets a lot of visitors from senior military officials from Department of Defense, from CENTCOM and SOCOM, who consistently regard the LAF, I'll go with LAF, as a reliable and credible partner in the counterterrorism campaign. They regard it as a partner worthy of our assistance, worthy of our cooperation and partnership. And we share that view very much. As I think one of your colleagues has said, Lebanese armed forces and Lebanon in general is operating in a complicated, difficult, sometimes fragile environment. But we hold them to certain standards. And as we have seen, or I should say what we have not seen, is evidence of the sort of actual military cooperation, maneuver cooperation that would really cause us concern between the LAF and Hezbollah. We have seen at times things that to us we would consider deconfliction. These are two military forces that are operating in the same battle space, and it's important that they don't start fighting each other. There's times, including during the recent campaign to oust ISIS from Ras Baalbek, in which we did start to see signals of higher levels of communication between the LAF and Hezbollah, things that do start to cause us concern, and I can assure you that those are foremost on our agenda when we talk with the Lebanese leadership. I know it was foremost on the agenda when Prime Minister Hariri was here, both in his meetings with the administration, and I'm quite sure when he was meeting with your colleagues here on Capitol Hill, and it will continue to be so. So I think that's the way we will continue to take it, to have a forthright conversation with them. What I don't think we can do is simply abandon them and cede the territory entirely to Hezbollah. If we do that, Hezbollah owns the battle space and Hezbollah owns the agenda. And to your point about pushing back on Iranian influence, Hezbollah is clearly a major tool of an expression of Iranian influence and expansionism. And if we abandon Lebanon to Hezbollah, we effectively abandon Hezbollah to Iran.
Good points. Thank you. Ms. Pryor, Lebanon, as we know, is scheduled to hold parliamentary elections in May 2018, in which moderate pro-Western parties will be challenged by resurgent Hezbollah-dominated coalitions. It's my understanding that a lot of the democracy and governance work that we were once doing in Lebanon, well, we're having to scale back over in the last year at least, and may not be renewed. Can you tell us what the U.S. is doing to support the 2018 elections process? What is our role there? How much is Embassy Beirut currently spending to help pro-Western political parties and actors in Lebanon without interfering in the electoral process? Have these numbers changed at all? Have these figures in the last few months? And if so, why the change? Thank you.
Thank you. We still maintain robust support to civil society groups, and we intend to do that in the future years as well. It is a vibrant civil society, as you may know, and valuable in holding especially municipalities accountable to their citizens. In terms of elections planning, we are currently in discussions with the embassy in Beirut on what is the best approach for that, and we're happy to keep you updated as those plans come together. I defer to Michael on the embassy side.
How much is Embassy Beirut currently spending? Are we involved in helping governance, the rule of law, civil society, pro-Western political parties? Not that we're involved in pushing a political party, but in the realm of governance, the rule of law, human rights, fostering democracy, those big-ticket items.
Let me get you a breakdown of all of that. I don't have all of those numbers in that level of detail, but I'm happy to share that with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you again for being here. Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to take a moment, Madam Chairman, just to acknowledge Ms. Pryor. We have lots of debates here. We talk about the budget and why it's so short-sighted and inadvisable to make drastic cuts to our USAID budget. And at a time when there is so much bad news, your description of the students and entrepreneurs and kids who are being helped with the work that you do deserves our deep appreciation, and I just wanted to tell you thanks. Mr. Radney, this committee recently passed a resolution, and Ms. Pryor, I should also thank all of those folks who are out in the field doing this good work, too. It's not limited only to you. We passed a resolution that I authored calling on the European Union to fully designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. As you know, in 2013, the EU designated Hezbollah's military wing, but not its political wing, as a terrorist group. We on this committee have been clear that's a false distinction. Last year, the GCC and the Arab League both designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. They made no distinction between military and political wing because they understand how the organization works as a single entity. The EU shouldn't make that distinction either. Europeans argued until 2013 that designating Hezbollah as a terrorist organization would hinder their ability to work with the Lebanese government. Today, they argue that the full designation would hinder their ability to help Syrian refugees inside Lebanon. I hear their concerns, but first, I think it's worth saying that artificially distinguishing between two wings of Hezbollah sends a deeply troubling message of legitimizing Hezbollah's activity. Second, I want to thank you for stating in your testimony that the administration has called on all governments to designate Hezbollah in its entirety, but I'd like you to speak to what specifically we are doing to work with our European allies on this issue and the broader issue of countering Hezbollah Is it your view that an EU designation would have real tangible benefits, like improved cooperation to freeze Hezbollah's assets in Europe, block illicit fundraising activities in support of Hezbollah, and help prevent the types of devastating attacks that have been a signature of their terrorist activity, all of which would ultimately be beneficial in Lebanon as well?
Thanks, sir. Fully agree with you. Hezbollah is not an organization with separate wings. It's a single organization, might undertake political activities, but it's the same organization that undertakes its terrorist activities and all of the nefarious activities that cause us and Israel and others in the international community so much concern. Fully agree with you that it's a false distinction. We've had a little bit of progress in convincing some of our allies, Canada most recently, I believe the Arab League and a few others have started to designate Hezbollah as a single organization, as a terrorist organization. The EU, as you point out, continues to draw what you regard as a false distinction. To their argument that it complicates their relationship with Lebanon, we continue to have a perfectly fine relationship with Lebanon, despite the fact that we designate and recognize only a single Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization. Likewise, our assistance to refugees inside of Lebanon, we're probably the largest provider of assistance to refugees inside of Lebanon, and our designation of Hezbollah hasn't affected that at all. So it continues to be part of our diplomatic engagement with the European Union, with other partners. We want them to understand how we perceive this. Tom Bossert at the White House wrote an op-ed that appeared just yesterday or the day before that addressed this issue specifically. We, I think, all need to stop pretending that Hezbollah is something that it's not. It is a terrorist organization. It conducts activities and plans for activities that threaten us, threaten the Lebanese people, and threaten Lebanon's neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Redding. I appreciate your strong statement and your efforts. And just quickly, I wanted to go back to the issue of the de-escalation zones and the suggestions that Russia and Syria have taken advantage of them to change the balance of power on the ground. Can you speak to the de-escalation zones, whether they're working, whether they're doing what was intended? Are these allegations true? And if so, what can be done about it?
Thanks for the question. So, yeah, we have been heavily involved in negotiating and trying to implement these de-escalation areas, and there's pieces of that I'm happy to talk about here, and there's other elements of it that I'd prefer to talk about in closed session with your permission. The de-escalation area in the Southwest in particular is the one we've been preoccupied with over the past few months. It's one that we have worked with the Russians and the Jordanians since earlier this summer, and began with a ceasefire that started in the Southwest on July 9th. It was always supposed to accomplish two things. One is to stop the violence and effectively freeze the conflict between the regime and the opposition, and in doing so, to stop those principal drivers of misery of the Syrian people, the violence that's afflicted those communities, that's driven internally displaced persons, that's driven refugee flows, that's destroyed property and lives and families. By freezing the conflict, it helps create a condition in which normality can return to people's lives, and we can create an opening and a pathway to a real political resolution. But it's also supposed to do something else, which is to start to exclude Iran and its proxies from Syria. Now, we have a view on this, and it's the same view as the Israeli government. We don't think Iran should be in Syria at all. We don't think Hezbollah should be in Syria at all. That's our policy, and that's our position. They've been a curse on Syria. We have to start somewhere. And by beginning with de-escalation of the South, beginning with elements, by stopping the violence and stopping that core conflict, and by undertaking activities which I'd be happy to discuss in a different setting that start to chip away at this Iranian and Iranian proxy presence in those areas. We think we make a contribution not just to the lives of the Syrians, but to the security of Syria's neighbors, and I mean in particular Israel and Jordan.
I appreciate it, and I would like to continue the conversation in an appropriate setting. Appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Now we turn to Mr. Cook of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate your candor on some of these responses, and I got to tell you, it's very, very hard for us, I think, to show or feel any empathy for Lebanon as a whole, because I think most of us feel that Hezbollah controls the country. I think they have a strong influence on the Lebanese army. Obviously, the Iranians are supplying through the ground route weapons, everything like that. So I almost have the Israeli viewpoint, and that is, as was previously mentioned, the number of missiles that are on the northern flank of Israel, that a country right now that has a terrorist group that has had a history of being at war with Israel and other individuals, as well as killing 173 Marines and other military personnel, I believe it was 1983, as well as kidnapping a U.S. Marine observer, a UN observer by the name of Rich Higgins, torturing him, castrating him, killing him. So there's a lot of history, and to get over that, when somebody that has military background and on the House Armed Services Committee, I think it's most serious threat right now to Israel because of the rockets, because of their history and everything else. And of course, Israel, unfortunately, I don't want to get too military, but they're faced with Iran, they're faced with Hezbollah, they're faced with Hamas, they're faced with the Houthis, the situation in Yemen. And of course, today, I don't know if that's been confirmed about the missiles, the Scud missiles going into Saudi Arabia. And it's like, I just cannot close my eyes to that. And I feel that sooner or later, if anything happens in Iran, it's going to happen in Lebanon at the same time, because you have to accept fait accompli in who runs that country. Now, I know you already elaborated on, and if you could just perhaps agree or disagree with me, because it's I understand the schools and everything, but all those schools are going to be destroyed when you have an exchange of that many missiles going into Israel. It's going to be total devastation. And I cannot see any way out of that box with that terrorist organization having that much control in it.
So it's certainly unnerving, the picture you paint and the reality on the ground. You use the word empathy, and I guess I feel a certain amount of empathy for Lebanon. Maybe it's because I lived there at one point. Maybe it's because of very long-standing familial and cultural ties between the United States and Lebanon. There's connections between the U.S. and Lebanon that are undeniable. But empathy doesn't address those hard-nosed questions of security that we have to grapple with. It doesn't address this question of Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon and the effect that has on the stability of the Lebanese state and the security of Israel. And those are serious questions we need to grapple with. And we need to grapple with them with the tools that we have in our toolkit. Some of that is strengthening the genuine national institutions of the Lebanese state and the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF foremost among them. This is a genuine national institution recognized by the Lebanese people across the sectarian boundaries as an institution of stability, one that the Lebanese people can be proud of, one that can represent and defend Lebanese sovereignty. That's one way. What we did at the UN last month, trying to strengthen the mandate of UNIFIL. UNIFIL is an imperfect creature, but both Israel and Lebanon recognize that its presence there has a de-escalatory, a calming influence on the situation on the ground. And we fought hard. Ambassador Haley in New York fought very hard to ensure that when the mandate was renewal, it wasn't simply business as usual, that we were putting in place the ability of UNIFIL to address some of these real concerns, to monitor, in the first instance, times when UNIFIL is blocked from being able to do their job, from being able to conduct inspections. And if that happens, they're obliged now to report that back. So this is how we're pursuing it. And again, I go back to a comment that I made earlier, that in an imperfect world, in an imperfect region, I think it would be a mistake to simply abandon Lebanon to those forces, to Hezbollah, to those forces of evil. I think we're duty-bound to at least try to reinforce those elements of Lebanese society that can start to push back on those forces.
Well, once again, I just want to thank you very much. I'm running out of time here, and I appreciate, as I said, your candor, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cook. Mr. Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. As I previewed when I was briefly speaking at the opening, I wanted to talk about the rockets, or the prospect of what would be a third Israeli-Lebanese war. Right now, there are approximately 150,000 or so rockets in southern Lebanon. being pointed at Israel, far more than was the case a decade ago. But it's not just quantity, it's also quality. These aren't rockets that can only reach Haifa and be fired randomly with a big variance in terms of where they would actually land. These are, of course, Iranian-funded, all of them, much more accurate missiles that can reach throughout Israel. So given that, and given I mentioned or previewed what a couple Israeli generals told me, when I was in Israel 2 years ago, a few of them independently used not the word if, but when there is a third war with Lebanon. Needless to say, that is deeply concerning given, as you pointed out, Mr. Ratney, just how much damage would be done between a third war between Israel, Lebanon, or Israel, Lebanon / Hezbollah. So I was curious on your take of what you think the prospects are of a potential third war between Israel and Lebanon, how likely or unlikely that is, and what sort of events you would look for that would bring it about.
Thank you. I'm a little reluctant to estimate the likelihood of it, but I will very much agree with you at just how unnerving, what a daunting proposition this is. You're absolutely right. The quantity and the quality of weapons in Hezbollah's arsenal is vastly greater than it was in 2006 during the last war. And you don't even have to be in northern Israel. You can be in any part of Israel to feel that palpable sense of what it would involve if war broke out between Hezbollah and Israel. The Israelis certainly have the right and the ability to defend themselves. That's the first thing we would recognize. We also recognize that neither Israel nor Lebanon and nor Hezbollah, to my knowledge, want to get in a war. I think.
All right. Well, that's. I mean, if you're not going to talk about how likely or unlikely it is, that's the point then that I want to get to, because unfortunately, in this committee with so many, just in the Middle East, so many things going on. Unfortunately, Lebanon has not gotten the attention that I think it warrants. So, how much should this be on our radar screen that Hezbollah would be gearing toward this, or is it, as some people think, something they would not want, at least right now, because of all the other things they're involved with?
Yes, so I think despite a lot of the bluster you hear from Hezbollah leadership, and there's some particularly obnoxious statements that you see from Hassan Nasrallah and others about the sort of damage they would inflict, I think they also recognize that a war with Israel would result in unimaginable damage to Lebanon, to the Lebanese state, not just to Hezbollah, not just to their military arsenal, but much more broadly within Lebanon, including in areas far afield. And I think they recognize that, and I would hope that they wouldn't want to own that, because that would be the responsibility that they would bear in the event of a war. I think for obvious reasons, Israel doesn't want a war. There would be material damage and human damage that would be, it's hard to calculate, but it would be certainly something that they would avoid at all costs. I don't think any side, neither the Lebanese government nor Hezbollah itself, nor the Israelis, are in any way sort of enthusiastic about those prospects. That leaves us with, what do we do to try to avoid it? Some of that is making sure that Lebanon and Hezbollah understand the cost of such a war. And some of it is the steps that we're taking, some public, some quieter, to try to push back on Lebanon's expansion, efforts that we're taking to try to squeeze Hezbollah's expansion, efforts that we're doing to try to squeeze Hezbollah's access to financing, to money, to moving money in the international financial system, to raising money overseas. And, of course, what I was saying earlier, steps that we're taking to try to strengthen genuinely national, responsible institutions of the Lebanese state that can perform the functions of a government and begin to marginalize Hezbollah and push them onto the fringes.
Yeah, well, I only have 20 seconds or so remaining, but toward that last part, that sort of institutional building, that very much segues into the important work USAID does and why it's important that these sort of soft power of the United States is not cut at this critical time. So with that, I will yield back.
Good points. Thank you so much, Mr. Boyle. And now pleased to recognize Mr. Issa of California.
Thank you. So, Mr. Secretary, the round and line of questioning included a discussion of 2006, and even though this isn't a military-oriented committee, if you don't mind giving your opinion of what you think, if this is correct. In 2006, Israel made a decision to take out Hezbollah. They rolled heavy equipment tanks into South Lebanon. They bombed virtually every institution and every bridge in Lebanon, completely destroying the ability to move anywhere in Lebanon. At the end of more than 30 days, they withdrew with their casualties and essentially have not been back in. So when I look at that, isn't it reasonable to say that at least at that time, with the defensive weapons available to Hezbollah, the Israeli army was unable to defeat Hezbollah?
So that's a judgment I'd rather not make.
Well, let's go through this. Was their goal to diminish or deter Hezbollah?
So
No, just please, because I've got very little time, and here's—
Certainly.
I'll get to my point if you just answer a couple
Yeah,
questions.
for sure.
There were rocket attacks actually after they pulled out, weren't there?
Israel is going to use the tools and the means at their disposal to deter Hezbollah and to try to degrade their capacity, and they would do it again.
Okay, so they may be willing to try what failed before. And the reason I'm getting to this, I was in both Israel all the way to the border, literally watching tanks come back destroyed with dead crews in Israel. I was in the north, literally looking at the destruction in both Hezbollah areas perhaps, but throughout the Christian communities, including the destruction of the environment there by destroying the oil reservoirs and taking down hospitals. I saw a war on both sides 11 years ago. And at the end of it all, Hezbollah was still there, and Israel had not defeated them. And the reason I say that is not to diminish the fact that Hezbollah is a cancer on Lebanese society and has been for my 16.5 years in Congress. But if we, in fact, assume that Israel could not, at least at that time, take out Hezbollah, then it's fair to say that all the things we will do to strengthen Lebanese society and to strengthen Lebanese armed forces are not effectively meant for a moment to believe that they can supplant Hezbollah directly, but rather to begin or continue moving Lebanon away from a dependency that could cause Hezbollah to be a bigger factor in Lebanese government and Lebanese society.
So for all the reasons you say and many more, that's why I don't think the Lebanese nor the Israelis relish the prospect of a war at this point, nor should they. And so rather than calculate or try to calculate the impact of such a war and who might prevail, better that we focus on how we avoid such a conflict.
So back to the avoiding. Since 2006, we have continued to support the Lebanese armed forces, and armed forces that I understand has never lost weapons. They have, in fact, been successful in, at least in part, in keeping ISIS out of their country without U.S. military on the ground. We have provided them aid, including even missile-firing, propeller-driven aircraft, and they've used them effectively to maintain a ISIS-free Lebanon. That's the good part, right? Additionally, I'm going to ask just one closing question, and this is in your wheelhouse, both of yours. If the Lebanese government were to collapse because of another war or other activity, who would likely prevail? Hezbollah and the Shias, ISIS and the Sunnis, or in fact, would we be back in a civil war? And I do want conjecture here because those are the three possibilities if a multi-confessional government were to fall.
So with respect, I'm not going to pick one of those three, but I will tell you that the fact that those are the three options really illustrates the urgent, absolute need to ensure that it doesn't happen, that you have a viable, credible, dependable Lebanese state, one that we support. So neither of those three prospects ever come to pass.
So in closing, the three pillars of Lebanese society, of course, are multi-confessional democracy, a banking system, and maybe I'm putting the order backwards, and a level of tolerance for refugees, including the Palestinian refugees, who still are in great numbers, and now over 1 million Syrian refugees. As we look at threats to their society, if you would comment briefly on the threats to the banking community should it fall, the threats we've already talked about to multi-confessional democracy, but the last one, if we are unable to ensure that sufficient aid is provided for refugees in order to keep those quasi-camps from becoming hotbeds of terrorism?
You know, having visited Lebanon, the last time was about a year ago, I can tell you that that last issue, the presence of that huge number of refugees, seems to be the one that is foremost on the minds of Lebanese. And I can understand why, when you have such an enormous percentage of your country to be refugees, not just, frankly, not just Syrians, but refugees that have been there from other flows of refugees in the past. We're appreciative of the fact that Lebanon has been willing to host these, and we're aware of the burden that it places. We try to help with some assistance, as do other donors. At the end of the day, we're dependent on Lebanon's ability and willingness to welcome all those refugees. They're clearly keen to see them leave. One of the reasons that we have been focused on de-escalation of the conflict in Syria, and I don't want to overstate the prospects for this, but one of the reasons is you start to create the conditions in which refugees can return to their home. I think initially you'll start to see internally displaced persons who are still in Syria return to their homes, but eventually you start to create the conditions in which refugees feel safe enough that they can return voluntarily to where they're from. That would be an unmitigated good both for Syria and for Lebanon. It's something we're working very hard for. And we're going to try to continue to work with the Lebanese government to ensure that they can bear the burden of these refugees and work with the security services to ensure that those refugee communities are not infiltrated by bad guys, including ISIS. And I know they work very hard to prevent that. So there's an area where we can see where the U.S. can actually make a difference in helping Lebanese society maintain stability despite those challenges. As you point out, the banking system also kind of a pillar, a national institution, if you will, of Lebanese society, something that's been a backbone of their economy. I think maintaining the viability of the banking system is important, but also, as we tell them and advise them very forthrightly, ensuring that that banking system is not exploited by bad elements, doesn't become a haven for money laundering. The record thus far has been good. We want to ensure that that continues to be the case. And the broader issue is a much longer conversation about maintaining conventional coexistence within a country that has been kind of riding that balance, sometimes just barely and sometimes not at all, over the course of its, in fact, its entire existence. That's where it sometimes gets tricky, and that's where sometimes even our ability, and obviously the situation that Lebanon is experiencing now, where the good news is they have a government, the bad news is that Hezbollah is a participant in that government. It's kind of symptomatic of just those sorts of societal forces that are at play.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Issa, very much. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, and again, thank you, Madam Chairman, the Ranking Member, for hosting or calling this hearing, and to our witnesses for being here this afternoon. I want to associate myself with the remarks that my colleague from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, made, Ms. Pryor, for the work that you and USAID do, not just in Lebanon, but around the world. And we have talked about this in this forum many times, but the need to emphasize the three pillars of not just defense, but diplomacy and development, and working to protect and pursue American interests around the globe is critical. So thank you for all that you do. I'm going to pick up the conversation where we were talking about earlier on Hezbollah. And 2.5 years ago, Congress passed and the President signed the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. And to what extent has that legislation had in affecting Hezbollah's ability to execute its strategy, achieve its goals?
So that piece of legislation and others that we have are among the tools in our toolbox, and one of our objectives, one of our overriding objectives, is to deny Hezbollah access to financing, where they move their money, how they move their money, how they get access to funds, and that's a tool that we have. And as information in the case of this particular piece of legislation, the particular tool that we have, as we get information, as our intelligence community and Treasury and the State Department have information to act on, we'll pursue those cases. We've also pursued designations of individuals who have been involved in moving moving Hezbollah money, designated them under various authorities that we have to ensure that they don't have access to the financial system. It's a challenging environment. In many cases, Hezbollah doesn't use the legitimate financial system in order to move money. So working with our partners, and that's a global problem. It's not simply a regional or a U.S. problem. Right. It's a global problem, to look for all of the ways in which Hezbollah and groups like it are able to move money and able to raise money internationally, and that continues to be an enormous priority of ours.
It's not just with respect to money, it's respect to acquiring arms. One of the things we've talked about here today is the 150,000 rockets that Hezbollah has stockpiled in southern Lebanon, aimed at Israel. There's also a growing concern of Hezbollah developing an indigenous rocket manufacturing capacity. Can you touch a bit on that? It's something we've introduced legislation last week to try to address that issue, but what specifically you think we should be doing?
So there's elements of your question that I prefer to answer in a closed session if I could, but clearly where you're going is an important, very important point. Principal source of most of these rockets and weapons is from one place, it's from Iran. This is the sort of mega problem that hangs over so much of what we're doing in the Middle East and certainly in Lebanon, and finding ways to prevent those flows of weapons is a major priority of ours. It's hard, but it's extremely important. Depends not just the security of Lebanon, security of Israel, and stability of the region depend on us to find ways to push back on that.
And that's a good lead into my third question, which I suspect will have a similar answer that we need to have in a different location. But the de-escalation zone in southwestern Syria, and real grave concern that not just militias aligned with Iran having personnel there, but literally IRGC personnel on the border with Israel, with Jordan, destabilizing that region, creating that land bridge from Tehran into Lebanon, through Syria. What steps are we taking that? What steps should we be taking further to make sure that doesn't happen?
So as we've undertaken these discussions with the Russians and the Jordanians, and that's been the principal trilateral kind of group that has been discussing the de-escalation area, the Israelis have been fully knitted into that process. And as many times as I go to Amman or elsewhere to meet with the Russians and meet with the Jordanians, I'm back in Jerusalem meeting with the Israelis, because their views, their concerns, and their information about what's going on is critical to our understanding of that part of Syria. And clearly one of the reasons we entered into this is because it's not just for the stability and security and ending the violence inside of Syria, it's to take steps that are going to address the security of Syria's neighbors, Israel and Jordan foremost among them. So they're very much a part of these conversations. I'm leaving Friday night for another trip to Israel, and that's going to be #1 topic of my discussions there.
Well, I wish you a good and successful trip. And in the few seconds I have left, Ms. Pryor, I don't want to leave you out. What more can we do to help what you're trying to accomplish to make sure, as we talk about the security issues, and the security issues are obviously paramount, but that we're also continuing to address the, in many cases, overwhelming development issues in Lebanon?
Thank you. Your continued support. Because of your support, we're doing some amazing work in Lebanon, taking the stress off some of those host communities. You know, for example, I was in a city in which half the population is now Syrian refugees. But because of the support you've given us, we're able to help them address those challenges and find win-win projects so that it isn't just Syrian refugees getting help, but disadvantaged Lebanese as well, and bringing the two groups together and having them see that they really share the same problem set and that they can also find solutions together as well.
And if I can just say in one closing second, that the investments we make in these projects, as was referenced earlier, may be at risk of being destroyed in a conflict, but I think making these investments today are the best path we have to avoid those future conflicts that hopefully they can stand for a long time. So with that, I yield back, but I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Donovan of New York.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I am at a disadvantage. I came from another hearing, as did my friend Tom Swazi, so you may have already touched on this, but I just wanted to ask both of you one question, kind of three parts. In each of your areas of responsibility at state, at USAID, and my colleague from Illinois just touched on it a little bit, what do you find as each of your greatest challenges in the region? What are you guys doing in each of your various areas of responsibility to address those challenges, and what would you need from either the subcommittee or full committee, this entire Congress, to help you further your efforts?
It's a big question. So this is a big, complicated region that we're dealing with, and the parts of it that I deal with it are a microcosm of that complexity. And within it, whether we're talking about our subject today of Lebanon, Syria that I deal with extensively, Jordan, the Israeli-Palestinian file, which we're still preoccupied with. All of these are individually extraordinarily complicated questions in which we're trying to find a measure of stability to bolster our partners, bolster the cause of moderation and decency and the ability and will to fight back against extremism, whether it's Iranian or jihadi or what have you. So that's the complexity. That's the environment we're dealing with. And the tools we have, whether they're military, whether they're development, whether they're diplomatic, are all critical. And finding the way to knit that all together is our biggest challenge right now, to assure that all of those tools work in concert. It's what we've been trying to do in Syria after a 6 or 7 year war that has left so many people dead, and we're trying to end the conflict in a decent way for the Syrian people. And we have certain tools at our disposal, some military, some assistance, some diplomatic. Likewise on the file, the Lebanon file that we're talking about today, that's the challenge, is making sure we're coordinated and knitted up. And I've felt, I will tell you my own personal experience, that we've had a considerable degree of support from Congress in doing that.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about the refugee crisis already, but there's another challenge that Lebanon faces that I'm equally concerned about, and the impact of the Syrian war on Lebanon's economy. Lebanese farmers have been particularly impacted because they've lost the land routes to their traditional markets for their produce. So we have been working with these farmers to improve the quality of their products, pursue more cost-effective techniques, and help them locate alternative markets. But the impact—
Interrupt you and you say they lost their routes. Is that because of terrorism? Is that because
the closure of the border with Syria.
I see.
So, and I've seen it devastated rural communities, but with very small targeted investments, we've been able to see some of these communities come back to life. So again, I would just say your continued support is what's most helpful. Thank you.
Thank you both for your service.
Thank you so much for that question. Thank you. And Mr. Swazi, I'm just so happy that I finally learned how to say your name that I'm just going to say it a lot.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Swazi.
So does UNIFIL recognize the existence of the rockets on the southern border of Lebanon aimed at Israel?
Sorry, do they recognize the existence of them?
Yes.
They're certainly aware of them.
Have they confirmed it? I mean, do they confirm that it exists, and have they documented it?
I don't know if they actually undertake to document those sorts of precise numbers. I don't know if that's within their mandate, but certainly. Yeah.
Do they take actions to address it?
I mean, their very presence, they're not a peacekeeping force in the sense of undertaking those sorts of active measures to confiscate weapons, if that's what your question is.
Well, what role could UNIFIL play in helping to identify and locate and, if necessary, eradicate those missiles?
Yeah, so the role of UNIFIL is a modest one. We'll acknowledge that, first and foremost. It's one, however, that both the Israelis and the Lebanese regard as useful. Their mere presence there has the effect of lowering tensions. What we've tried to do with the renewal of their mandate just last month is to strengthen it. They can't just be a force that has people on the ground wandering around. They have to be, they have to be actively out there inspecting. They have to be actively out there reporting back to the UN if there's instances where their efforts to inspect are blocked. And they have to be setting the stage in which the Lebanese armed forces ultimately can take up that role themselves of policing and monitoring their southern border. So that's the ultimate objective, and it's a slow process of working with UNIFIL to try to ensure that they take a more active role.
Is there any indication that the Lebanese armed forces have taken on that role of trying to identify and eliminate those rockets?
So they've started to take on the role of redeploying to the south, and that's an important step. And the more their capacity builds, and the more we're able to build that capacity and build that credibility, and in the process reduce the influence and the pervasiveness of Hezbollah, we would hope that their ability to do that would grow.
So if the ultimate objective is to try and eliminate those missiles from existing in that location, what role can we ask UNIFIL to play to try and help us to accomplish that objective?
To continue monitoring what they see, and to continue reporting what they see, and to continue telling us if there's instances in which their efforts to monitor the situation is obstructed.
And do you see that, I apologize again,
No.
do you see that that's been done? Have there been, is there a document that says we've identified these missiles in these locations? I mean, most of our information comes from intelligence sources
Right.
as opposed to UNIFIL. So wouldn't it make sense that UNIFIL would say, we have this document that says we think these rockets exist in these locations, and, you know, we think that somebody should do something about that?
Yeah, it's a fair point, and what I can try to do is round up for you the sorts of reports that UNIFIL files with the United Nations.
About particular locations?
Yeah, I don't know exactly the level of detail that they go into in their reporting back to UN headquarters, but I could certainly endeavor to find out.
Would it be reasonable to try and request UNIFIL to do something like that, to take on a more detailed role in giving us more detailed information about the existence of these rockets?
So we're trying to take this step by step. We're trying to get to the point where they're taking a much more active role of monitoring and inspection, and a much more active role in reporting in which those efforts have been blocked. And so this is a gradual process. I think it was an important, small but important step when we incorporated those measures into the mandate renewal last month. We have to continue working with them. We made clear when that mandate was renewal that business as usual, the approach of UNIFIL in the past can continue. We need something that's more active.
So would it help your efforts if the Congress was to take some sort of role to make that formal request of UNIFIL to provide specific documentation of the detailed location of these rockets?
So can I take that question back and think about that and give you a considered answer?
Yes, you can.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I yield, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Radney and Ms. Pryor, our subcommittee looks forward to working with you in our evolving U.S. policy toward Lebanon, very interested in the upcoming elections. And we look forward to hearing from you in a classified setting to know the efforts that we're undertaking to seek the liberation of United States permanent residents. Nizar Zaka was always in our minds. Thank you so much. And with that, our subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.